Currently. Yeah, so I'm a product manager at Microsoft, and essentially I have been a PM for the last 5 years or so. But before I was a PM, I'm originally from India, so I did my master's in electrical electronics engineering there, and then I came here to pursue this course called engineering management. I don't know if maybe some of the people might have heard of this course. It's offered at this they used to call it the consortium, where there were 8 universities in the US that were the first ones to offer it. And I think now it's becoming more and more widespread. So essentially, went to Dartmouth for that. That was a while back, moved to the US 2016. And the course was around 1.5 years. And that course was interesting in the sense of essentially having half of the engineering classes with the engineering school, and then the other half with the, let's say, the actual people in the MBA program in the business school. And that provided quite a perspective because the MEM, the target age range for that program was people mostly in their early 20s. There were few people in their late 20s or early 30s, but that was really the cohort. But then MBA, you see people late 20s, early 30s, maybe even older. And so it really puts a lot of perspective. And with that, I was really glad that I made that call to come to the US to do the master's there. At that time, and I know right now, like there's a lot of focus in the industry on like user research and design and like all of those product disciplines. But at the time, and even now, like product manager has not really died down as a job, I would say. I think a lot of people want to be PMs. But at the time, like that was the only job that people would talk about. And with platforms like LinkedIn and all of those sort of like related social media, like there was a lot of conversation around those things, right? Like there was a lot of conversation around like what really is a product manager, right? Like what is a project manager? What is a program manager? And the nuances weren't really visible. The one thing that was clear at the time though was everyone saying, oh, PM is the job, right? Like it's a rock star job. Like we should all be PMs, right? And so I'm hoping to talk a little bit more about that because I feel like if I knew what I know now, I would have been a bit more sort of informed in terms of understanding how to sort out the kind of PM role I want to get into. And that brings me to my experience, right? As soon as I left Dartmouth, and as all of you must know, right? Like when we're leaving university, we're trying to find all our internships and our full-time jobs. Our peers become our competitors for the same job sometimes, right? Like you'll find your classmates, you'll be interviewing for the same position sometimes. And I've had many of that experience as well. So when I was leaving, I actually found a job as a business analyst, which in some companies means an entry-level PM. But business analyst is a very generic term because it's a very broad term, right? Like each company has a different definition of business analyst or PM or associate PM and so on and so forth. And so I found a job in that at an energy tech company. So tech adjacent essentially. And my focus was very broad, right? Like my focus was on just essentially like an IoT scope of a product. So from devices to like backend services to APIs and then to the front end UI as well. Like it was a lot of culture shock, I would say, right? Because suddenly you are in an academic environment where you can control a lot more of your output. In a job like PM, your output is defined not just by you, right? There's a limit to what you can sort of act upon, but then you need to also extend your influence, right? And that was quite the learning for me because I had so many broad areas. I had to work with many different teams. And then after that, I transitioned to Microsoft a little over a year ago. So, and I am now focused more on the UI and the UX side of a product, right? So today, I'm hoping to give you some insight into the day in the life of a PM, how to get into PM, product management specifically. I know there's program and project, and I'll touch on that briefly. Why product management, right? I feel like people don't really talk about your inherent motivations of trying to get into that discipline, right? Like that's something that I personally also wasn't talked to for the same reason, right? Like if you would look at LinkedIn back in 2015, 2016, I mean, there's a lot more traffic on there now, a lot more blog posts, but the blog posts on there were all about like, oh, there's some common PM myths, right? Like, which I have now discovered are myths, but they would state it as a verbatim, like a truth, right? Like, this is the truth of the PM job, even though PM was a very new discipline then, and it's still evolving now, right? Like, there's many different kinds of PMs, depending on the scope you inherit or you stake a claim on, right? And then, so yeah, PM myths, and then what are the some, setbacks or difficulties that you should prepare yourself for? And then the last thing would be, observations, right? Like what I think are things that might be helpful to just understand, like, how can I be a successful PM? Like, what are the things I can grow in? What are the things I can sort of think about, and so on and so forth. So I'm sure people must have heard this, but each day is different, especially when you're a product manager. The only things that keep it the same are if you have some ritual type meetings, right? So if you have Scrum every day, if you have like a team sync, right? Or a lead sync where you're presenting to leadership, where you're talking like, oh, in my this sprint, I'm covering these many features. So each day is different because each day essentially PMs, as you may have heard already, right? Like people work with many different stakeholders. And depending on the kind of PM you are, your stakeholders will be very different, right? So the kind of broad product management roles that you will see are people on the API or on the backend side, where you are essentially the subject matter expert, right? Like you are the technical expert, like you are supposed to know the ins and outs of the API or of the service that you're building. And what that means is, oh, like from a platform perspective, like I am working on this project that will help maybe performance or scale of this thing. And I'm working on understanding like, okay, what information can I share with this API, right? I'm working to understand like, what are all the scenarios? What are all the edge cases, right? And then the other end of the spectrum is the UX, right? So user experience, which is my focus right now, and API was my focus in the past, but mostly just like on the page, right? Like on the website, on an experience that you show in the company, what does the user want to see? What do you want to show them? What are the end-to-end scenarios? How do we set the user up for success, right? And APIs also have to think about set the user up for success, but their users are not human users, if that makes sense, right? Their users are other consumers in the org, right? Like what are the other UX sort of front-end services that are putting in the information, taking in their information, right? Then there are some PMs that focus on both those things. So in my previous role, I was focusing on both, right? I was the same PM, I had a different API team and I had a different UX team. So I had a lot of control in that way in terms of, I tell the API person, API devs the same thing, and then the UX devs the same thing in terms of this is how you show the UX. And that way I could make them work together. But depending on the company and the team you are in, you might have different API and UX teams. And that's where the influence part comes in, right? Also, because my role was IoT type, my focus was also on devices, right? So you can be a device PM, right? Like you can be working on iPhones, you can be working on Fire TVs, you can be working on Alexa, right? And like the machine learning and all of those things behind that, right? Like the firmware aspect of that. So there's a bunch of stuff that happens in the device front too, where I think there's a lot of end users that appreciate what happened, but they don't know all the effort that goes behind making a device successful, because the device cycles are much, much longer than your API or UX cycles, because software can be easily iterated upon. Hardware and firmware, you really have to think twice, thrice, 5 times before you make a call that can impact the functioning of the product. And so definitely with all of my focus, I felt like device one really needed me to be very, very technical. But yeah, so you can have different types of stakeholders depending on the type of PM you are and depending on the type of activities you will have to do. So I'll take device as an example, right? If I'm working on like an iPhone as a product, or Alexa as a product, or Fire TV as a product, I don't not only have to work with the firmware devs to figure out, hey, how can we make these changes remotely to Fire TVs, right? Like the updates you see on a Fire TV, you have to make remote changes on that. How does that happen? There's a bunch of firmware devs making that happen. They're maintaining a platform where they're pushing the changes. So if with a click of a button here, I can update my TV, right? I work with the device PM, you have to work with API and platform PMs, and then you have to work with design as well, right? Like, oh, this iPhone is becoming sleeker, or like, how are we changing up things here? And then you have to work with your logistics teams. Like, that's really important in that role, like with supply chain and with operations, to figure out, okay, am I able to get all the things in that I need, for this product to be set up successfully, right? Like for a UX PM, for instance, you have to work with research, you have to work with designers, you have to work with devs, you have to work with API PMs, you have to work with data scientists, right? So there's different kinds of stakeholders you work with for different roles. And there's different priorities and different activities, right? So like, for example, for a UX PM, an activity would be something like a design review, right? Or like something like a requirement review is common to each type of PM, right? You have to lead with your requirements. But for a UX PM, it will be working with researchers to figure out, okay, what's our research plan? What kind of people do we want to, work in a focus group with, or what kind of people do we want in a setting to, like, what kind of feedback are we looking for? What are our goals, right? With data scientists, you have to define, like, okay, what are my metrics, right? Like if I have 500 users doing this X, Y, and Z, is that a success to me? And how do we get that right data to instrument that, right? So there's different kinds of activities. I think the only common activities that are common across all kinds of PM is like presenting to leadership sometimes, or presenting to your manager, right? Like, this is my feature, this is what we're planning to do with it, this is my plan, this is my requirement doc, and so on and so forth, or talking to customers, right? But then I want to caveat that with the fact that even with customers, right, you could have, like, I want to set expectations, right? Like when you enter as a junior PM, there will be very few roles where you get to have customer, like, direct interaction face to face. But that's only because you have to grow into it a little bit, right? But it is a part of your job too, to like understand what the customers really want. And then the common thing that remains just in almost every day, because it's a very meeting oriented, very people oriented job, right? It's a lot about bringing people together, right? You have to understand, like, how do I align all these people? How do I resolve conflicts they might have, right? How do I understand, like, where each of them are coming from? And then that way it can be, you have to sort of set a balance with yourself, right? Like, you have to sort of understand what your boundaries are, and like what part of it the job is training versus what part is energizing. And so that brings me to my next point of, like, how to get into PM, right? And before we do that, I think it's important for everyone to reflect, like, is PM the path for you, right? And if it is, like, why or why not, right? Like, take a really good look at, like, yourself inherently, and like look back at your experience in, like, college or grad school, and or like in group projects, right? Like, what are the skills have you acquired? Do you think you are methodical? Do you think you're good at planning? Do you think you're detail oriented? Do you think you are visionary, right? Like, are you one of those people that gets into a group project excited, like, oh, I want this, this, and this? Or are you one of those people who are more responsible, and it's like, oh, I think we should do it this way, right? And I'm not saying each quality is a better marker for what kind of PM you will be, because each PM is different too, right? And so sort of like understanding examples from your group projects of, like, hey, what do I see myself doing that I can transfer over to this role, right? Because you have to think about, okay, influence, right? Like, can I influence people? Do people listen to me, right? Do I, and if not, like, what is my tactic, right? Because that happens too. I think that's one of those struggles of early career PMs, which I definitely went through too, right? Like, I went into this job and I did struggle for a couple of years. And I to the point where I thought, is this the right job for me? Maybe I should focus on something else, right? Like, is this the right job? How do I figure out, like, do I need to become a different person? Like, sometimes it comes to that even, right? Because I think at that time, a few years ago, I wasn't exactly confrontational. Not to say I'm super confrontational now, but I wasn't exactly direct. And I knew I had to change my communication style a lot to be very, very clear and very, very precise on, like, the goals of what I need, right? And to set the right context, to set the right expectations. So I feel like if someone on LinkedIn, like, all those years ago had talked about this and had talked about, like, hey, PM has challenges too as a job. Like I would have been more realistic in my focus. But either way, I think reflecting is the first thing that you should do. And then when you're reflecting, right, it doesn't mean you will have an answer straight away. I think for some people, it's a very like gut instinct. Yeah, yes, I can do it. Or other people, it's like, I don't know, maybe, maybe not. And so I think something that can help in that reflection is if you do your research, right? If you do your research, there's so many PM jobs out there, right? There's so many APM programs out there from so many different companies, right? And so doing the research of all those jobs and figuring out what part of the role do I like, right? Like what part of the responsibility do I like? That's exciting to me versus the things that don't, right? Like what are the things that drain you? Like for instance, for some people, they love organizing, right? They love holding people accountable. They love planning, right? They need to know what the plan is. They can't do without a plan, right? For other people, it's more like in the flow and very intuitive and like they will take each day as it comes, right? And I'm not saying that you have to be either or, but PM job is all about balance, right? You have to be one person with a particular kind of team and you have to be another person with another kind of team, right? Like I worked with 4 teams in my previous job and here I work with mainly one team, sometimes a second team, but mostly one team. And even on the same team, right? Like with different kinds of devs and with different kinds of designers, you have to become a different personality. So it's a lot of personality shape shifting within a day too, where I'll have some people that are way more like precise and they know like what it is. And then with that, I have to sort of model that aesthetic of just letting them be, right? And just chiming in to like really share my concerns. But I know like in terms of design or technical implementation, they got it. With other people, I have to be way more hands-on, right? I have to understand like, okay, what is the plan? What are we doing? What are we doing a week from now? What are we doing 3 weeks from now, right? Only because that role in my other work streams has been taken up by someone else, right? So these are the kind of things you need to figure out is like, what's going on, right? When you do that and when you start researching, you will see a trend emerge. You will see things that you like about a job versus stuff that you don't like. And then the more you research jobs, I know during grad school, me and my peers, we had such a hard time because we were networking like crazy. And that's the first thing they taught us in that program is like, you have to network, you have to build relationships with people that came out of from your grad school and you have to talk to them. And I remember and I'm not exaggerating, I literally talked to 90 people over the course of a few months. I was having maximum, I think my personal best was 5 phone calls a day just to figure out what the job was like, right? Because people, the way they write their LinkedIn bio sometimes may or may not align with what they're actually doing because everyone's job hunting on LinkedIn, right? Or everyone's portraying themselves in a certain light. So networking really helps you gain context of what kind of things do jobs need, right? And all of that information gathering will help you structure your resume, will help you align your LinkedIn messages in a way in terms of like reaching out to the people to sort of make your case for what kind of job you want to do, right? And I think that's really important. And then the other thing to prepare for PM is just essentially, you know, there's this book, Cracking the PM Interview. I think for PMs that are just starting out, that's a really good book for beginners. Understanding, and then of course, practicing mock interviews, like either with your friends or online with strangers, like, or even with yourself, right? Like you don't have to wait for someone to practice this, like you can even record yourself, right? And then I know it's super cringy, but then afterwards you can hear yourself speak and you will see, oh my God, like I really messed up here, or I can streamline the story in a better way, right? And then if you're interested in entering the tech industry, there's so many different kinds of interviews, right? And each company does it differently. Like I've interviewed at Amazon, Google, and of course, Microsoft before. And they each have a different pattern and they each value different things, but the common theme is the same, right? Like a product design interview, a case study interview, a technical interview, right? A strategy interview, like figuring out how as you as a PM engage on all those concepts and what can you really think about in terms of all of that, right? So I think that's super important. So why PM, right? And maybe this is a good time to sort of engage in how product, project, and program are different. So project is very logistics focused, right? Project is very, you work with devs, you understand what their capacity is, right? You understand, you are the one tracking all the milestones on a project, on all the features. You're figuring out which person will be on which project at what time. You're aligning timelines, you're understanding risks, you're mitigating risks, you're presenting to leadership in a slide deck, like these are all the things that can go wrong. These are the things actually going wrong. This was our original target. This is our new target. Like you are the one that's driving that bus, right? So that's project. Program management means so many different things, right? I think Microsoft earlier used to have PM program manager titles, and now just recently they split it into product and technical program manager titles. But program is more initiative based, right? So it's one level above project, I think, because it's a combination of different projects or different features coming together to build the overall roadmap, right? Like this project can impact this project, that can impact this roadmap, and so on and so forth, right? So program is also like that, like really complicated, just like looking at a 30,000 feet view. Complicated, like not in the negative sense, complicated more just complexity, right? Like there's all these features contributing to each other and you need to ensure that all the dependencies line up, right? And then product is about, like, I know people talk too much about this, is where they talk about, oh, we put a strategy and we call the shots and that's what product is. Sure, that's what product is, but that's, I would say, like 5% of your time, right? Like product, I think, is a combination of everything. It's a combination of program and project management too, because you as a PM, as you rise in your career, will be put on more and more ambiguous projects or products. And then you will have to think about, okay, which team and which org do I reach out for this, right? Which dev on my team will work on this? Are they holding their weight? Are they not? How do I inspire them to work on this? How do I pull them in to work on this, right? In the way that I need them to work on this, right? How do I understand what kind of working style do they have, right? Like these are all things that you need to sort of reflect on and think about before you apply it too, because then there's different PM disciplines, right? Like, of course, project, program, product, but within product too, as I talked about earlier, you have API, UX, device, and then all of these. And then there's other kinds of, like you can have performance PMs too, like there's different kinds of things. So thinking about that, right? And then of course, industry too. So I entered the energy tech industry because I'm really passionate about energy. Like I got an energy focus at Dartmouth as well. That's really my passion. And so that's why I went into that industry. And now I'm in tech because it's exciting to be, in a way, like just trying to set focus for a lot of the innovative things we get to work on, right? And so sort of thinking about the industry too is like, what kind of industry do I want to thrive in? Like more conventional, more traditional, more innovative, an industry that has been lagging for a while, but you see things changing for it. Like that's what I thought about energy, for example, for the longest time, is like, it's gonna change, right? And then the last thing, but really a lot very important, is like understanding what does stakeholder alignment mean to you, right? And I know people on Medium, on LinkedIn have started writing all these articles about their personal experiences, which is great. Like there's a lot to be learned from your own experience and from other people's experiences. Like experiential learning is very, very powerful. But then it also means like what they did in their circumstance, do you see yourself doing that, right? Like you will see some very, very radical stories on these platforms, which I don't blame them, because it's the attention economy, right? Like some of these stories will be very radical, some of them will be very extreme, some of them will be more realistic, right? There's a whole bunch of things out there. But instead of like taking their advice and just taking it off all on your own, it's also about like, okay, how, if I were in a situation, how would I handle this, right? Have I had a similar situation like this happen to me in the past? How did I handle it then? How do I see myself handling it now? Because what will happen as you leave college is you will be the junior PM, right? You will work with people that have maybe 5 years more experience than you, 10 years more experience than you, 20 years, 30 years more experience than you, right? And it is daunting. It is really, really daunting. And I think no one prepares, and that's why I'm trying to set expectations here, right? Like no one prepares entry-level PMs for that. especially the graduate schools or the graduate colleges, right? Because this is a new job. This is a new job role. Like, your professors may or may not know, right? The way that they know is all about through an external observation of it, right? Because this is a really, really new discipline. And so you have to understand, like, okay, what's my personality as a PM, right? And you have sort of to define that identity for yourself. So that's super important. So with that, I think these are some of the common myths I've seen play out over the last few years, which I feel like, and maybe there might be other PMs that might debate me on this, but this is sort of my opinion since I'm speaking here right now. So these are some myths that I think are just that, they're myths. I don't think it's true. I remember when I was trying to enter into the PM role or even the project or program role when I was coming out of college, this line, PM is the CEO of the product, would be your clickbaity headline on top of all the blogs that I would see everywhere. PM, why should you be a PM? PM is the CEO of the product. And then the myth 2 sort of ties into myth 1, but it's a little bit different. Like, oh, PMs get to have the final call, right? And I feel like the way the job was advertised, in my opinion, was very ego-based, right? It was very like, you will get to make the call, by the way, and you will make the decisions, by the way, and you are the CEO, you are the shining face. Well, guess what? You don't, because you definitely get to influence and you will get to make the final call if you influence everybody that you work with, from the devs to the designers, to the researchers, to leadership, right? That this is the right call to make. If you influence them, then you are the final decision maker, right? And sometimes you may not be able to influence them. Sometimes you will get overridden by leadership, and that's fine too, right? Because then that's their strategy that they're trying to steer towards, right? And you and leadership, you have to figure out, like, okay, what way am I aligning? What way am I misaligning, right? And those are some really, really delicate nuances that you have to figure out, right? And so PM, I don't think is the CEO of the product. PM is more the person that sort of is trying to create the safe space for everybody to sort of is the listening ear, right? Like trying to really listen, to really hear someone when they're coming forward with their concern, or like really trying to understand what their motivation for steering a project in a particular direction is, right? And so I feel like PM, when they try to glorify the PM as you are the CEO, you are the face of the product, right? But when things go wrong, who gets blamed first? It's the PM, right? It's not the devs, it's not the designers, it's the PM, because the PM is the one that brings all these people together. The PM is the one that's the face to the customer. The PM is the one that works with other PMs too. And they have their own perspective sometimes. And that can sometimes be your hardest challenge as you rise as a PM, is when you're working with other PMs and they have their own motives and those motives may not align. And then they all want to work on your product with the same thing. And you have to ensure, like, okay, is everything aligned or not, right? So that's why I think those are myths. The third myth, I alluded to this earlier, but no, it's not just about the product. That's like 5% or 10% of your job. Like, you will have a feature spec, you will write it, you will present it. And maybe 5% of the time, everyone will be like, that's beautiful, we love it, we agree. The other 95% of the time, so many people will have so many opinions. They will have so many ideas. They will have so many concerns. And then it's your job to include all that, right? Like, you will have a doc. Like, I've had pages and pages of docs, and I've had like hundreds of comments on them, right? So it's your job to sort of understand and prioritize and give weight to the things that are worthy of giving weight to. And then that's a lot of responsibility on one person, right? Because then you have to understand, am I giving weight to this opinion? Like, the engineering manager says this, the GPM, the GM says this, the director of PM is saying this. Like, what do I give weight to and how? How do I validate this opinion? Do I get this data? What data do I get, right? So the product itself is one thing, the vision is one thing, and that's the myth 4, right? Like, it's not just about presenting the vision and making sure, like, oh, I just gave this really cool talk, and now everyone, all 50 people in the org will just go and do this because I said it's important. Unless you are like at the partner level or at the VP level, that's not happening, right? And so even especially as a junior PM, mid-level PM, senior PM, you have to keep doing this exercise of like not only presenting the vision, but inviting everyone into the conversation. And then ensuring like, okay, how is it sort of wrapping up from here? Like, how is it sort of gaining traction from here? Is it dying down from here, right? Like you have to control the pace on the project. Unless if it's your project, right? If it's a partner's project and you are supporting them, then they control the pace and then you have to deliver. And that way you have to sort of put on a little bit more of your project and program management hat. The last myth is this, and this is the myth I was fed when I was an entry-level PM and I read all those articles, is like all PMs should have their own product that they own. And this, I feel, especially for entry-level PMs, it's awesome if you get that, right? It's completely awesome. Like if you get to have, you will get to have features, by the way, but if you get to have a product of your own that you just own, you're coming out straight from college and you just own this product and it's all yours, that's great. But there will be scenarios where your manager, right, as they're trying to coach you to become, to start stepping into the job, they might put you on features that, you have to deal with one stakeholder at a time, right? Because they're trying to put you, sort of get up the learning path for you, right? They're trying to see, okay, how will you tackle this situation with this feature, with this, like a good manager would do that, I'm saying, right? Like they're trying to sort of increase your bandwidth, right? They're trying to see, okay, this person is, they're fresh out of college, right? Like the most difficult conversations they've probably had are in the sense of their group projects or maybe in their internships, but even in internships, right? Like you know what I mean? Like I've been an intern myself, right? You get to control your internship project a lot. And that's not the case when you're an entry-level PM. It's like you won't, there might be times you won't have your own product, right? You will have a few features here and there. And then you learn up this, like get up to speed on like, okay, how do I say no to this person? How do I set the right boundary with that person? How do this was the original expectation and now that has changed. Or like this person set this expectation, but they deviated from it. How do I hold them accountable, right? And when you get your own product, you have to hold 100 people accountable, right? People even from your own team will fail you sometimes, right? So you have to hold everyone accountable. And that's a lot of pressure to put on someone that's just trying to enter this job and just trying to learn, right? So if you don't get your own product the first day, like don't be disheartened, right? It takes time and it takes, a sense of understanding of, okay, like how will you say no to someone who has worked in that role for like 10 years, right? Like that happened with me, right? Like I would always run into pushback earlier in my previous jobs. And that happens, right? Like people will have a bit more experience and then you need to get into that sort of frame of mind of like, okay, how do I defend my project and how do I defend the way I am convinced we should do? Why am I convinced? How will I debate this person? How will I set the right boundary with this person? And I think that's super, super important to get a sense of. And the more you do it, the better you will get. It's like one of those jobs that no one's a natural PM. I think once you enter it and you just get better with it. And especially the more sticky situations you're in, really help hone that. So yeah, some observations for a successful career. I mean, this is not really a laundry list, but this is what I've observed so far. And there's more things than this, but I think these are the top things. It's like, firstly, being observant, right? Like being observant of whichever company you are in and whichever project you're working on, like what are the dynamics of the environment, right? Who are the key decision makers? Like which projects have an air of excitement around the org, right? Like what is the senior PM leading that everyone wants to like know about, right? Where is the feature headed, right? Like the features that you are given. You can do something for it in this sprint and it can be done. And some features are like that, which is fine. But then there are other features that have potential to become broader, more widespread, right? And so it's up to you to think about, okay, where is this feature going? Then sometimes it's also important to notice your environment, right? Because you have to, especially you have to manage, like you have to you have to toe the balance between both project and product management. And when you're in an environment, because you will also have devs, right? Like you have to convince the devs too. And the devs are the most technical people. They're the ones actually building the things. So it's important, really important to influence them, right? So you have to understand, like, is this working for me, right? Like are in this environment, am I seeing people open up to me? Am I seeing like the way I do things, is that working? Do I have to change my approach? So on and so forth. The next thing, same, is like conflict resolution, ability to convince and influence. Like those things are really important. And influence only builds with time, right? When you are day one starting somewhere, you will start from the ground up, right? So you have to learn, like there will be very tense situations too, where people have started to point fingers, right? They might point fingers at you because you are the PM. If you are the face of the product, you're also the person that gets blamed a lot, right? So people, instead of pointing dev to the person that built it, they will point blame to you, right? How do you handle that? Like sometimes you might get blamed for things that are beyond your control that you didn't do, right? So how do you clean up that situation? How do you balance that, right? And these were the things people didn't talk about like years and years ago. People are starting to talk about this, but these are like, I just want to be very realistic about the job. Also, something important about PM, right? I know we all want to be inclusive, and that's always the way, but it's also about timing, right? If you get your timing wrong, like if you involve someone from the dev team too early, when the designer is just creatively brainstorming, and they come in and they say, oh, our code is built this way, can't design this, this, and this. And then the designer now feels locked in a corner, right? Like they're like, what do I design then? You know, so that's not something you want to create, because it's your job to create a safe space, and you have to time it. Like, when do I include someone and when do I involve someone from the get-go, right? And then you have to also observe the way in which your stakeholders work, right? So different devs have different days of times of different styles of working. And then your designers might also not, like, no designer is the same too. Like some designers will have 4 or 5 ideas. Some will have more like a more sort of rigid approach of like, this is how I want to do it. And so you have to sort of observe that too. Like it's a PM job is a lot of observation. So yeah, I think that was my last slide. So yeah, I think that's all I had for today. So yeah, I think I'll open the floor, and I know we have 20 minutes or so. So I'll open up the floor for questions.
Thanks for that presentation. That was a lot of information in a really short amount of time.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah. Looks like we have a question. So I can read out the questions that are in the chat, and if anyone else feels comfortable unmuting and just asking the question, that's fine too. So the first question we have is, have you ever worked with a software engineer explore intern? And if so, what qualities a team considers when recommending interns for like long-term positions, like rehires, I guess? And how does a team determine who would make a good intern during the interview?
Okay, so I have worked with SV interns before, but not an explore intern specifically. But essentially, I think the mark of a good, and I've worked with a couple of good ones too. I think the mark of a good intern, an SV intern, or even a PM intern is when so there's 2 parts to it, right? There's the interview part, and then there's when they're in the job. So because I think the first part of your question is focusing on when they're in the job, I'll focus on that first. So when they're in the job, the marker that they're a good intern and they're likely to get a return offer, which also I've seen, like we had a PM intern last year and she got a return offer. She's a full-time PM in my team now. And then we had an SBE intern this year. He was amazing. So I think we might want to think about getting him back. I'm not sure, but the fact that what makes them amazing is their accountability and ownership, right? Regardless of your job title and like you're only there for 3 months or 6 months, you come in and of course you demonstrate like a growth mindset, a curiosity, but you also make the project your own, right? Like you will write documentation, you will be proactive, you will reach out to not only the PM you're working with, but if you see a little bit more of another PM that you think might help you, like this intern reached out to me, even though my the feature was not directly related to me, to be like, hey, like, what do you think about this, right? Like validating that, like building relationships across the team, having one-on-ones, right? They take accountability, they take ownership, they present like what their view of the feature is, they present the fresh eyes they have, which of course, people that are in the team that work on something for a while, they don't have that, right? And that's really, really invaluable. And then you come up with an approach, like the way you can impress senior SDEs, right, is with like, oh, I think like we can implement it this way and that way, right? And then they're like, yeah, perfect. Like this is way more efficient, right? And so like those kind of accountability, proactiveness, ownership, like that really makes the case for someone to get a return offer. In the interview, like I mentioned, right? In the tech interview, especially, they will ask you really broad questions, whether you are interviewing as a designer, as a PM, or as an SVE. And they will ask you like design whatever XYZ, right? And it will be broad on purpose. So what they're trying to test you in that is, how do you think about a project? What's your thought process, right? Do you immediately jump into solutioneering, as I like to call it, or do you scope out the problem? Do you figure out like, okay, this is, let me stop sharing. Yeah, so do you figure out, okay, this is the, like, you know, during the interview, that's how you can impress people, is you can say, hey, like I was thinking, are you thinking about this customer segment? Are you thinking about that? Like, what's your main business goal here? Is it money? Is it new users? Is it more users? Is it more steady users? And then like going with that, and then sort of talking about how you would design a certain thing, I think impresses people. And another thing they will do during the interview is they won't let you speak, right? They won't let you speak like for 30 minutes going on. If that's happening, like I don't want to speak for a lot of interviews. If that's happening, that's not a good sign. But if you're performing really well, they will keep interrupting you, right? They will keep throwing you off track. They will keep saying one thing or the other to throw you off track, to see, hey, I am, how do I say it? I am, you know, creating problems in what this person is trying to think. How do they think on their feet or not? Are they reactive or not? Because that's real life too, right? Whatever your original plan for any feature or any product is, it's probably never going to go that way, right? And so, and that's a fact. So that's how it usually goes in interviews. I'm not sure that answered the question, but interview rounds for a PM intern. So PM intern, there's many different programs for PM internship. The way the PM internship programs happen, if you sign up for it, is I think there's 3 or 4 rounds, and you don't directly interview with people that you might be placed on, like the team that you will be placed on with, like that's probably not the people you're interviewing with. You can be interviewing with anybody in all of the org, because there are interviewers within the org that are experienced, and they have that mark, right? They are called the as appropriate interviewers, because they're really, really good at interviewing. They are like, in Amazon articles, you must have heard of the bar raiser. So Microsoft also has their version of that. And so if you do for a PM intern or like entry-level PM job direct from college, like you may not have interviews with the team you might be placed on, because if you get approved, then it's like, okay, you can either be in this team or that team, and then you get to choose. But for a full-time PM role, it's usually 4 rounds. There is a phone interview, there is maybe a manager interview, and then there is the full day rounds, right? You can have with the engineering manager, with the PM manager, with a peer, with a dev. Like you can have 4 different personas in the interview, and they will test you on different competencies, right? Like if you were to interview at Amazon, for example, they will interview you for the leadership principles, and then you have to figure out the story you will tell, right? And some of the interviews will be behavioral, some of them will be more technical or strategic, and it depends on the person and what they're testing you for. And there's no way of knowing, because those questions are so broad, they can fit like 2 or 3 things that they're trying to test you for in one. So usually it's around 3 to 4 rounds of interviews.
Well, I had a question for you.
Yeah.
So I know you brought up the growth mindset a lot, and I know that Amazon is known for this leadership principles as like a culture of its company. So is the growth mindset like the overall culture at Microsoft, you would say?
I would say so, right? Like, so, I mean, yeah. And I don't want to liken growth mindset with the leadership principles because Microsoft has their own principles, but growth mindset is one of them, right? It's one of those things where like you will be asked about in like not directly, but it will be said, okay, like if you were to reflect on how you did things, and you will see that was in my deck too, right? Like reflection. How would
Mm,
you do something better, right? If you were in a group project at college and fights erupted and you didn't get to do what you wanted and your score tanked, which has happened with me in college too, right? How would you tackle this going forward, right? Because it really shows, and that's important for us because it really shows that this person learns, right? They learn through their mistakes. They even learn through their successes, right? Even if you did have a success, part of me believes it's not because you did everything perfectly. Like you could do everything perfectly, as perfect as you thought you could, like 90% of the time, but their circumstances sometimes overpower you, right? Like they can come in and change the course of everything. Like, yeah, suddenly you can have a reorg. Suddenly your skip manager can say, no, I want it this way, right? Like you, there's a lot of luck and timing involved too, and like things going right. So even through your successes, it's so important to like reflect on what did I do right, what could I have done better, right? And so that's super important.
thank you.
So I see, what qualities would a first year college student need to have for applying for an internship without much experience? Yeah, yeah, so that's a good question. So I guess for the first year internship, that's really tricky because you're just starting out, even in college, right? And your first year college, like for me, my first year was very common with all of my peers. I didn't really start my specialization in engineering yet. And so it's interesting. I think first year you have most things that you have include just your transcript and your group projects. So something that can help you set apart be, and this is a lot of people are doing this right now, but so I don't want to say this, but prototyping things on your own, right? Like what are the things that you just did that was your passion project in your field, right? If you are in CS major, did you build a website? Like, or did you try to control your smart home alarm from your phone? Did you build an app, right? And it doesn't have to be like this big or broad, just be like, hey, I was tinkering around, I was thinking about this, right? Because at that level, like people just want to know of your interests and like how you approach things or how you would sort of take away from things. And like those are the kind of things that help set, I guess, the focus of, you know, like the question I answered earlier about the internship interview, right? Like, oh, do we want this person in, you know, for the next 3 months, and maybe we can train them, right? So like showing growth mindset, showing an interest, showing curiosity, showing creativity. I think those are really important things, and those things don't change, right? Whether you are in first year of college or first year of your job, right? Like those things remain the same. There will be some interest that you will have and you are more inclined to sort of take on. So
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in. If you had have signed up for the project groups, that's like another great way of having some experience put on your resume. If you've like participated in like a project making um, with your peers and like making like a cool project over the course of the semester. So hope you're signed up for that too. I think we have time for like one more question.
Be able to go into the sort of technical skill requirements of a product manager and also differentiate a little bit more of a program manager from a product manager?
sure, okay. So start by differentiating program from a product manager, right? And so a program manager is someone that essentially is working with different engineering teams. They're working with different devs. And a program manager, like the title is so broad, it will differ on what team you're in or what company you're in, right? But program manager, essentially what that means is you are planning out the next 6 months, right? You are planning out this feature needs to happen first, but oh wait, this feature has 5 dependencies. Are these 5 dependencies landing in time for this feature to start? Are they landing? Are they delayed? Do we have an alternative, right? And that's part of the product role too, is like, if something's delayed, what is my alternative, right? Like if we're supposed to release on this conference and something's getting delayed, how do I announce it without compromising on the quality of what I'm delivering, right? So that's what a program manager does, is sort of making sure everyone is held accountable, but even in the technical details, right? I feel like they also look at the technical details of, is the API working? What's the blocker to the API? Which other team do I need to file a dependency on for this part of the API or a brand new API? Is this the right thing? Is this the wrong thing, right? And so that's what a program manager does. And so that's why it's like hard to differentiate between program and product, because a product manager also has to do some of these things, but a program manager is very logistics based, like in the everyday. Product is maybe a little bit less so. And then the technical requirements of a product manager is essentially understanding, right? Like, again, depending on the role that you take on, whether it's technical or not, like device PMs are way more technical, or API PMs are way more technical, right? But then you have to sort of understand, like, how is the API working? If API sends this response back, like what business logic do I need for a particular user experience or for a particular device to behave a certain way? How do I define the behavior? What are my functional requirements, right? Like for a device, it's like if it's an outdoor smart meter, for example, this needs to withstand these extreme temperatures, right? Like sort of spec writing. And so those are the sort of the technical requirements, is like, okay, is this API performance, like what are the performance requirements for this API? Like what's the latency, right? Understanding the technical concepts, especially if you work in cloud. So if you work in GCP or Azure or AWS, right? Those are way more technical roles. Or if you work in the IoT realm, that's also super technical. So understanding the technicalities of the product, because sometimes the devs will look at you and they'll be like, make a call, right? I can do it this way or this way. What do you want? And then you have to be able to engage in a debate with them of like, okay, if we do it this way, what are the compromises that I'm making, right? I understand the API is going to give us this, this, and this. Will this still happen in the UX in this way, right? Or will this still happen in the device in this way, right? Like, how is it impacting my end product? So understanding how the technical sort of sources you're receiving as a PM and your dev team, how that influences the product you're releasing, if that makes sense, and what the implications are. I don't know if that answered your question.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Cool. So with that, I think let's all thank, if you guys could just react or just type thanks in the chat for Arushi and the time she took today to talk to all of us. And that was a lot of information in a really short amount of time. So thanks so much for taking the time out of your day speaking with us. And we really appreciate it.
Of course, yeah. I hope this was helpful.
Really helpful.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Thank you for attending, everyone. And thanks, Arushi, once again. And have a great weekend, everyone.
Have a great weekend. Bye.